Thank you very much indeed for all coming to tonight's BIOS seminar. And tonight we have, four speakers, I should say, not three, so three more than the usual one. And we're very honoured to have them all to talk tonight about human bodyoids, what they are, and why we do not need them. And I shall This will be a very brief introduction to the four speakers. These are people who've collaborated on work on this subject. Dr. Bruce Blackshaw is an associate research fellow of the Biocentre, I'm very pleased to say. He also holds an honorary fellowship at the Plunkett Centre in Sydney. Daniel Rodger is a registered operating department practitioner and a senior lecturer in perioperative practice at London South Bank University. Christopher Bobier is an associate professor and co-director of the M1/M2 Medicine and Society course at Central Michigan University. Daniel Hurst is director of medical professionalism, ethics and humanities and assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine at Rowan University of Osteopathic Medicine in Stratford, New Jersey. So we have a very international lineup across several time zones. So I hope we're all awake. And just anyone who's coming, the Biocentre, if you'd have a look in the chat, we're always very happy to take donations. We're run on a shoestring, and we very much appreciate any help. And without further ado, I will pass over to the first speaker, Dr. Bruce Blackshaw.
I'm kind of the first speaker, so I have a PowerPoint to go through, but I'll get the two Daniels and Chris to jump in wherever they like, because the original paper that kicked this off is Daniel Rodger's idea, and he's the first author, and Dan's very good at pulling other people in to collaborate with him, and so we're all collaborators. And so that first paper was published in the Journal of, I think it's Philosophy and Technology, and that prompted a reply or two, and we published an extra couple of short commentary papers as replies. So we've all, I think Dan was the inspiration and wrote most of the original paper, but we've all contributed in different ways, and I've ended up with the presentation. Probably someone instructed me to. It's nice too. I haven't seen David Hirschenoff since about a year ago, when he was one of the examiners for my PhD thesis. So nice to see you again, David. Okay, I will go and share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint. Again, guys, feel free to hop in where I've summarized. You want to elaborate or so on. Application window, let's go. And okay, everyone seeing my initial title screen? Good. Good. Human bodyoids, what they are and why we don't need them. Our paper starts off with just a statement of what the actual problem is, why people even think we might need bodyoids. And the reason is there's a worldwide body shortage in medicine. Medicine needs more bodies. We need them for organ transplants, for medical education, for research. There just isn't enough, and particularly for organ transplants. As we all know, people die all around the world daily because of a shortage of organs available for transplant. So there's a shortfall of thousands in that regard. Been lots of proposals to address aspects of this shortage. Financial incentives, xenotransplantation. You can talk to Daniel Rodger about that, whose PhD thesis is all about that. And the proposed solution that was proposed by Charlesworth et al. Is to create bodyoids, which they define as living human bodies without the neural components that allow us to think, to be aware, or to feel pain. human bodies are genetically altered through CRISPR gene editing technology. They're deliberately deprived of the capacities for thought and conscious experience. So basically, very different to us in terms of no phenomenal experience. And the way you create these well, they are speculative at this point, of course, but they suggest a quasi-human embryonic structure. You create it in the lab, you manipulate pluripotent stem cells, genetically engineered to inhibit the development of the brain altogether, and then implanted into an artificial womb, gestated, born, and possibly grown to the size that they're needed. They argue that this method, basically having no conscious experience or no possibility of conscious experience, would avoid most of the ethical objections that we might think of. Well, I mean, there are ethical objections, even if that was the case, but on Lockean accounts of persons, in other words, John Locke's idea of a person as a thinker, an entity that can think, Charlesworth's bodyoids, they wouldn't really be ethically problematic from that point of view because they'd be unable to think. They could never think, and they never would think. But of course, Lockean accounts of persons are not the only accounts of persons that are out there. The substance view of persons, on that view, this is less certain. On the substance view, human beings, we're basically rational beings, and we're persons from the very beginning of our lives, from the zygote onwards. So on the substance view of persons, it kind of depends on whether a human embryo or a zygote is created first. If this is the case, and then it's modified, then as on the substance view, even a zygote is a human being with the same rights and dignity as all of us, then its rights would have been violated. So if bodyoids involve that as a step, then on the substance view, that would be, we would regard that as impermissible. The Christian view that humans are created in the image of God would also find this problematic. Catholics, I think, would find the entire process objectionable. I mean, Catholics tend to be the Catholics I've discussed this with and that I've read of. I'm not Catholic myself, but find IVF objectionable because basically, I mean, they have some very good reasons for that. And yeah, so the whole process of creating bodyoids, I think Catholics would probably find is ethically objectionable. Given that it's currently legal to experiment on embryos up to 14 days old in most jurisdictions and pushing for 28 days and probably is legal 28 days in some places, I doubt most people would find these ethical concerns of really much to worry about. As Christians, as people who might hold to the substance view, certainly they are, but I would say most ethicists hold to some kind of Lockean account, and they're not going to be too worried about these particular objections, I think. If anyone wants to hop in here and comment, please feel free. In our paper, we have a number of objections, but we start off with practical objections. The first practical objection is that, as I think we probably all know, ectogenesis, the process of developing an embryo all the way through to a 9 months period of gestation, we're nowhere near able to grow human bodies in artificial wombs. So that is a very big stopper at the moment. Probably an equally as big a problem is the brain plays an important role in later development. Obviously not early in development because we don't really have a brain and up to a certain point. But it's uncertain whether development beyond that point, when the brain develops, when it starts homeostasis and all that kind of thing, whether normal development is really possible past that point. I guess the conclusion there is that brainless bodyoids are a long way off, and it's going to be decades before they have any chance of solving the body shortage problem. That being the case, what about almost brainless bodyoids? Perhaps they can be engineered to develop only the minimal neural structures required for bodily growth and regulation, homeostasis, the brainstem. So the idea is, if we can genetically engineer a human being to only develop with the brainstem and nothing else, then no conscious experience, but maybe we've got all the bits needed for the body to develop properly, and perhaps that will solve the problem. Eliminate the parts of the brain responsible for nominal awareness, but keep the parts that are needed for bodily growth. That does introduce a new ethical problem, is distinguishing between these bodyoids and human beings that are kind of in a similar state. If you're in a persistent vegetative state, anencephalic infants, perhaps patients with very, very severe brain injuries, they all have legal status as human beings right now. And then we have the problem is, how do we distinguish between them? And it's important to be able to distinguish between them. Otherwise, we kind of get a moral leakage from one to the other. If it's okay to utilize bodyoids for organ transplants, well, why not these kind of infants or people who are in persistent vegetative states and so on? It just kind of starts eroding our boundaries, our moral boundaries. There's also the experimental trajectory. How are we actually going to identify the right genes to modify? That's going to involve considerable experimentation on human embryos. And it's going to end up with numerous failed attempts. It may be 3 to 6 months, maybe later, before it can be determined if the brain has developed as expected with only a brainstem. I mean, how are we going to figure that out? And what do we do with the failed experiments where actually the brain did develop beyond that? And so, what happens there? Do we just end their life? I mean, they will be human beings with some kind of capacity for phenomenal thought, perhaps. It's an ethical problem that would have to be determined what is done with them. It's also possible, and this is kind of a scary possibility, we may create bodyoids with some kind of conscious awareness, but be unaware that we've done so. If you create a human being that's unable to see, hear, perhaps speak, but still has some kind of conscious experience, maybe that's not possible, I don't know, but perhaps they can see. This is all extremely speculative, but the only reason why we think other people are conscious, because we extrapolate, they're like ourselves, I think I'm conscious, therefore other people are conscious, there are other minds out there. Well, when bodyoids are engineered not to have that consciousness, so they are different from us, but we don't really know whether that succeeded or not, we could have a real moral problem there, maybe a problem that we'll never be aware of. I think that's a scary possibility. It's kind of analogous to, is an AI conscious? Well, can we ever know whether they're conscious or not? One of the last objections, or not so much an objection for creating these, but just pointing out that it really does seem economically unfeasible. Assuming ectogenesis from IVF embryo right up to birth, it's eventually perfected, it's going to be really expensive. And in our paper, we do kind of say maybe it's comparable to the cost of neonatal care. Now, how much is neonatal care? I'm not a medical doctor, I don't know, but I remember a friend a philosopher friend in the United States whose newborn was in intensive care or in neonatal care for, I think it was about a month. And I remember that online they posted their hospital bill, which insurance paid for, but it was something like $984,000 for those 30 days. So, assuming there is some kind of comparability to neonatal care, this is going to be expensive. The bodyoids may need to be kept alive for at least several years after the normal gestation period, because I think most adults who have failing organs probably don't want organs from an infant, so they're going to have to be grown to some extent. Maybe they need to be 10 years old. I'm not sure. That's obviously also going to be really expensive. Maybe that will also be 10 years in an artificial womb, or I didn't really know how that could be done. But again, it adds up. The total process is likely to cost several $1 million or maybe more. I don't know. I guess you could speculate and say if we did enough of them, then mass production would bring down the cost. But it doesn't seem to have really done that for neonatal care.
There's other things as well in terms of the cost, like the risk as well. So, imagine, this is why it is highly speculative. I mean, this is like, imagine that a bodyoid was being looked after and they became hypertensive. Their blood pressure went really high because something went wrong, or they weren't being looked after properly for a short period of time, or and now suddenly, those organs that have been, growing for several years have now been damaged to the point that they then can't actually be, used for the purposes that they were being designed for. So I think, like Bruce has outlined really well, is that there are these kind of layers upon layers of speculation. Now, some people might think about, well, why do we even even consider this? Because I think the more you talk about it, the more kind of outlandish it gets. But I do think it's probably important to talk about, anticipate these kinds of things before the discussion gets too serious, so we can kind of identify, actually, look, this is, on the economic point, as Bruce has made very clear, is that actually we don't even have the technology in fact, this would be impossible without ectogenesis. And if you speak to the kind of experts looking at artificial womb technology and things like that, I mean, most of them will say that that's probably never going to be possible, to have that kind of matrix style. If you've seen the matrix style artificial wombs, most of the technology is looking at, can we get, premature babies around, that 21 weeks into some kind of artificial environment, for a temporary period to, make sure they're kind of, the morbidity and mortality risk can be brought down. But this idea of kind of starting from an embryo and developing it in an artificial environment, I think even the experts say is not something they're really think is possible at the moment. So that and the idea of generating a bodyoid is contingent on something like that being possible. So sorry, I just want to jump in quickly, Bruce, so I can add something.
No, I'm hoping you guys will jump in and just elaborate where necessary. That also makes me think too that if you do have to be in artificial womb for, say, 5 years, it's entirely likely that your organs are actually not that healthy, because is your heart going to be that healthy if you've never exercised? Or, it's hard to see how that's even going to work. But so it does look economically unfeasible. I think the other point too is that funding doesn't just magically increase when someone thinks of doing a project like this. Funding comes from other projects as well. So there is only a certain amount of money available. And, when it comes to technologies like this, you do need to consider, well, are there any better ways of procuring organs than trying to this incredibly speculative technique of growing bodies in artificial wombs? Okay, dehumanization. This is one of the kind of, it drew a bit of a critique from a commentator. We made the point that creating bodyoids, it kind of reframes the body as a tool or resource for other human beings. So it's kind of a commoditization of the human body. And this instrumental view of the human body, it seems pretty likely to undermine the respect that we have for human bodies in general. It might make us less morally sensitive to humans in persistent vegetative states or anencephalic infants. We might drift. I mean, the whole point of creating a bodyoid is to procure the organs. I kind of don't think they're going to do post-mortem procurement if you had bodyoids, because post-mortem procurement is, it's more problematic to get the healthiest organs. And so if you're spending millions of dollars creating these things to get the organs, then you're probably going to try and take the organs out while they're alive. And of course, they don't feel pain or anything like that. So why not? But it might drift towards pre-mortem organ procurement for these other human beings as well. It's just something worth keeping in mind. Obviously, this kind of slippery slope argument is speculative, but once these technologies are out there, it's always a bit late to decide their use is unethical. So it's I think that's a big part of bioethics, is trying to think about these questions before they become reality. And of course, if they do become reality, these kind of discussions help shape the legal framework before they do. And that's always important with these kind of technologies. One of our commentators asked about IVF. Well, what about IVF? That's been hugely successful and that hasn't dehumanized anyone. Well, that's Alexandra Erler has argued that as in response to us. Well, we're not so sure about that. We argue that IVF has actually resulted in significant dehumanization of embryos. Well, I mean, firstly, we got millions and millions of frozen embryos with uncertain destinies all around the world. And if that's not dehumanization, I don't know what is. Probably most of those will be eventually discarded or possibly experimented on. And secondly, IVF has paved the way for mass embryo experimentation. Without IVF, we wouldn't be experimenting on embryos like we do all around the world. And so on these 2 points, we think Alexandra's wrong. IVF has dehumanized embryos, at least. Maybe not born human beings so much, but certainly embryos. And with that point, we're open to questions, and not only questions, but for my co-authors, if they've got extra additional things to throw in, now's a great time. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I just reiterate just quickly. As I said, I think I've had questions from people before when we kind of discussed, why would you write an article like this? Because why would you respond to something that seems so obviously silly? They were their words, because I think on the face of it, it seems kind of prima facie absurd. But as I said, there were a lot of these kind of ideas get proposed by academics, and some of them are silly and they end up becoming reality. So I do think, as it's part of something I take seriously, I know, that's why I got my co-authors involved, is that actually sometimes I do think it's really important to identify these issues before people start taking them too seriously, and actually point out that this is so absurd on a number of different levels. And I think that's what we try to make clear in the article, is just trying to, before anyone starts having a serious conversation about that this is pretty absurd.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that, Daniel. So this wasn't this was originally proposed by Charles Worth, who I think was a PhD student at Stanford. And his advisor, at least the second author on the publication, is Hank Greeley, who is no obscure figure at Stanford. And they published this in the MIT Technology Review, which is no obscure kind of thought journal, online news place. So, these are at least some bigwigs who are talking about this. And I think one of our responsibilities as bioethicists is to confront ideas and to think about them in the open space like this, and have a public dialogue on them. So, yeah.
We've got David who's asking a question.
Hi. People always surprise us what they'll do for money or even altruism. Maybe there'll be commercial surrogates who would be willing to gestate a bodyoid. Did you guys think about that? Or that would at least get rid of the ectogestation worries. I had obviously new worries. Did you, has that been mentioned or thought about?
Well, that is a good question. It certainly didn't occur to me. How about my co-authors?
No, I don't think we considered any of the writing. I think mainly because Charles Worth and that's they don't talk about. I think their assumption is essentially that for it to be feasible, it would require artificial an artificial setting. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, that would set it would address one issue. I suppose you then open it up to a whole host of other issues. Primarily, I imagine legal, and I suppose the artificial setting, it's still going to require something. So even if you bypass an artificial womb, you're still going to have to keep them on some kind of ECMO or some kind of artificial setting for the foreseeable future until they have developed to a point in which their organs can be taken. So yeah, you're right. So that'll be one way to address part of the technological requirement, but it would really only just delay it until later on. Because again, and we know things like ECMO that they use for people who are seriously ill and keeping them alive for a certain period of time, incredibly expensive. Not all so to think about having some kind of artificial setting for them to grow for a number of years, again, just kind of delays the problem, I think, and I don't think anyone, or at least anyone who's proposed it, has provided a kind of good way to do that. But yeah, great. Yeah, it's a really good idea, David. Thank you.
Yeah, well, also that would reduce the cost. You could probably offer someone $100,000 to be a surrogate rather than pay millions of dollars for an artificial womb that doesn't exist yet. So that certainly does help on two fronts.
So there's a couple of comments. So Christopher Bobier is quoting Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, saying, "Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." So that's a retro comment there. Jackie Edmonds asks, "How can we stop this experimentation? If it is possible, someone will do it." So any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose at the moment is that it's not possible. So I think that's the primary obstacle is that even if we did remove the kind of more speculative element around the artificial womb, the reality is even if we utilize a surrogate, what's required is not yet possible in terms of although research into CRISPR is developing at quite a pace. We don't have any way at the moment of knowing whether with any confidence whether we could remove the possibility of consciousness to the level required that would still retain the organism's, if it's legitimate to call it an organism, its ability to carry on typical human development, so that those organs could be used at a later date. So there's that issue, and then there's the one that I noted in response to David's excellent point about using a surrogate, is that we still don't have the environment where we could nurture and grow. I don't know how to, I don't know how to talk about that, though, to keep those bodyoids developing for a number of years. And then also you have the cost element as well, is that venture capitalists and other kind of willing kind of donors or investors in something like this, it would be extremely high risk and a long time before you'd even know if you've been successful as well. And that's besides the ethical issues that Bruce noted around whether we could even know someone was not conscious or didn't have those capacities fully. So I guess there'd just be a few points I'd raise.
I would probably contribute that it's going to be incredibly expensive, and we have to ask ourselves, right? Are there alternatives to the problem that give rise to this interest? And I think there are. I think, when we look at advancements in xenotransplantation, when we look at, my current, my medical school that I work at right now, is we don't have cadavers. We use AI and virtual reality to teach human anatomy. And the evidence has shown that students like it and it's effective. So really the need for human descendants to teach human anatomy is, it makes a lot of sense, but, I think we're seeing that it's maybe not necessary, not needed. And so I really do think, right, when we talk about transplantation in the United States, it's like, it's expensive to transplant a kidney. And that's the cheapest one to transplant. And so now we're going to have this really, expensive additional patent protected proprietary human grown type, bodyoid kidney that will be an additional cost to it. I don't think it's going to be financially feasible because I don't think people will be able to afford it. I don't think payers will want to pay for it. And I think there's alternatives that are worth pursuing.
I think it's really
Okay.
I think it's really interesting if I can just chime in for a second. I think the market for something like this is going to be in the transplant space. And so as a department chair, we still use cadavers in our lab, and a cadaver is going to cost you about $3,500 in the US to procure. And a bodyoid is going to be much more expensive, I think we can say, than $3,500. So I think the market is for transplantable organs. The question in my mind would be, if we had VC capital behind it, and people are going to pay for an organ if it's life-saving, right? If they can afford it and it's life-saving, I think they're going to pay. How much? I don't know. But especially if we can make it similar genetically, and so their immune system treats it as same, and they're not on immunosuppressants or not on as strict of an immunosuppressant regimen as an allotransplant or certainly as a xenotransplant, I think that there could be a market for it. Certainly, it's going to be expensive, to Chris's point.
Can I just ask, sorry, this is, there are rules about trade in organs in England. I'm not quite clear. In America, does it vary from state to state, or are there strict rules about financial benefits?
We can't pay for it. You can only pay for reimbursement. So,
right. So
if a donor, if a living donor is out money for a hotel and travel expenses or something like that, they can be reimbursed that, but no sort of like a Iran system where you have a kidney market essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Just a comment from Heidi Klessig. In Jan Jekielek's recent book, Killed to Order, pages 85 to 86, he exposes that the Chinese Communist Party has already begun farming babies through state-linked surrogacy programs to be used as organ donors. So that would be something worth following up, I think. David Hirschnoff, another question.
Yes. how long do anencephalic babies live with how much intervention? And also, what about just a PVS bodyoid? I mean, they can live for a long time, right?
I don't know that any of us are really clinicians on the call, David, to answer that with specificity. Daniel Rodger is probably the closest to a clinician that we have.
Yeah, I don't know the specific details. I think this is the thing. You can think about existing human beings where you could do that. It would be, it would be at least technologically feasible, but morally and legally prohibited. I think we'd all agree. So yeah, this is kind of a way to source humans similar to that, but in a way that is from the outset designed to be, well, presumably more morally palatable than than utilizing or killing existing human beings. It's kind of a way. Well, if we assume generally that that people have to have some capacity, whether we say it's consciousness or sentience or something like that. If we can remove what we generally ascribe to give the general public point of view, to give a value to human beings, if we can remove that from the outset, then it becomes sort of less ethically problematic for people. I suppose that's why they framed it that way. But in a way, I suppose people were making this arguments if they could access those bodies in a legal or moral way, then perhaps they'd be the kind of people who would find that acceptable. I can't speak on their behalf, but presumably that may be the case.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the proponents of this kind of bodyoid things will be committed to certain views about the person that actually, in a sense, they're going to want to treat certain kinds of human beings in certain kinds of states as receptacle, as carriers of organs that can be used. So, in a sense, who are they trying to appeal to? Because, in a sense, if they've already made an assumption about a whole range and category of human beings, maybe at the very beginning, or anencephalics, or people who are so-called brain dead, or even people in PVS. But, who is it that they are trying to appeal to, given that they already presumably think you can take organs from people in all these other states?
Yeah, I mean, me and Bruce specifically have talked about this before, looking at kind of issues, the logical implications of like kind of psychological accounts of persons. As soon as you ascribe, that certain psychological capacities are required for persons, once you've embraced that view, certain acts become permissible. That's why Gibellini and Minerva, with their famous article about post birth abortion and things like that, is this is the kind of thinking, the kind of things that become morally plausible if you
Mhm.
accept those accounts of persons, which is why we as a group have tend to be challenged the very idea of psychological accounts of persons because of these kinds of implications and the way that it really does lead to dehumanizing certain groups of the kind of human community.
So I do want to chime in that when we initially submitted the paper to for review, we had a substantive couple of paragraphs on how abortion, those who are critical of abortion, may have a similar concern here. And I forget what exactly we were tying in. I think it was in the section on, a lot of people take embryos seriously. And we ended up removing that. And the reason we ended up removing it is because the reviewers were like, we're not having this, like it just doesn't apply to us. Am I misremembering, Daniel? But I vaguely remember that.
It does sound plausible. Yeah, I do remember having something. I think we ended up sneaking something in a footnote. I think about the thing I was talking about the psychological accounts of persons. I think that was about as close as we got to anything abortion remaining in the paper. But there's certainly, yeah, I can't remember the details, but there was. pretty certain that your characterization is correct.
Yeah.
I have to search my emails.
And I do want to sort of circle back to at least some of the legal policy challenges of implementing this in specifically the United States context. So the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, which is renewed every so often by the U.S. Congress, prohibits any funding for the creation of human embryos. So that would probably have to be removed or modified or something in some way. And then, of course, in the United States, the National Organ Transplant Act prohibits, as Daniel mentioned, the sale of human organs, which would also have to be changed or altered. Whereas there's alternatives, right? So like if you look at something like xenotransplantation, you can sell genetically engineered pig organs. That doesn't violate the National Organ Transplant Act at all. In fact, it's totally open. But when we're talking about human organs and creating human bodies, then that's going to be a policy, legislative, regulative quagmire that I just can't imagine seeing how it could be passed.
If they're classified as such, though, right, Chris? I mean, from a regulatory perspective, right? They may not be classified as human. And so there's some sort of other
way to do it.
Yep.
Well, of course, it's precisely because they're human that they want it. I mean, that would be the
yeah.
Just another comment from Heidi Klessig. Alan Schumann, who spoke to us last month on the subject of brain death, has written about problems with using anencephalic infants as organ donors. And there's a link to a paper there for anyone interested in following that up. So are there any more questions on this very interesting topic with if rather alarming?
I guess something I could just raise here that maybe we could discuss is the question of whether these bodyoids actually are human or not, and comes down to what our definition of human is. If we're using CRISPR to modify their genetic codes so that they don't have anything other than a brain stem, it seems entirely possible that someone could decide that they aren't human or call them subhuman or something else. So, I mean, is human defined by our genetic code? And if our genetic code has the requirements for developing the phenomenal conscious part of our brain knocked out, what are they at all? I don't know. I mean, it depends on your definition.
Well, one thing, not directly to answer your question, but one thing I might argue or say would be, what is the moral status of an activity that brings about something that is very close to being human, even if you have a reason that you think that it's not human? How would we assess that kind of activity? Because it looks as though, from certain points of view, there are proper ways of bringing human beings into existence. And okay, if you say that it's not human, but it's human enough, or it's connected. I mean, how are people using their gametes or their sexual organs? Are they engaged in a production process of a living human being from their own genetics, from their own gametes? Do we treat sperm and eggs in a particular way? So even if you have some doubt about whether what you've created is human, are you using your own human material, sperm and egg, etc., in a way that is respectful of those reproductive capacities, which are to do with fatherhood and motherhood? Is that a correct use of that? Now, that's sort of dodging the question, but if anybody wants to address directly what Bruce has said, now is the moment. So you just have to define what a human being is. It's not very difficult question to ask. Helen, what? To the question.
Could you? I mean, I find it always helpful to, if you're asking if you've got a human organism present, is to ask, can we see what's missing here? it's a bit like the question when you have conjoined twins, and it's not clear whether the second twin is an actual twin, or whether it's just the remnants of a twin, so maybe just legs or something like that. And if you see a leg sticking out of a baby, you wouldn't think that the rest of the body is missing exactly. That's just not a second organism. Whereas it looks clear what a being without a head or a properly working brain or whatever is missing. If it's acting like an organism, if it's organizing its own material, but it looks like a very damaged human organism, rather than just some random limb or something like that. But the other thing is, of course, to come back to your other point, your point just now, Anthony. I suppose unless you're starting with an IVF conceived embryo and then doing something to that embryo to produce a bodyoid, someone might say, well, we're starting with adult stem cells. So to what extent is that misusing your reproductive material? Now you can still say, you are generating something that looks too like a human, even if you thought it wasn't a human, despite the fact that you're not starting the same way. But yeah, it's a little bit further.
Sorry, I was assuming an IVF embryo, but I suppose even in the adult stem cell case, you might say you are in some manner reproducing, although or replicating at least. And is that disrespectful of your as it were, life-giving powers or something?
Well, it's easy to see if you do
it's
something
the same way cloning
yeah.
might be objected to on those grounds.
Yes, I mean, if you thought they weren't human but just too human-like, yes, you could say it was more like fertilizing an animal egg with a sperm when that will lead to nothing. But nonetheless, it seems a misuse of human reproductive powers at some level. But yes, I mean, a successful cloning results in an embryo. So successful human cloning would result in a human embryo. And I suppose that's the question we're asking, is it or isn't it?
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this before, I just kind of, again, I haven't probably think about it a bit more. I just kind of think about the bodyoid as a intentionally damaged human organism. I don't think that's kind of the way that I've thought about it in my head. It's just, presumably, if we could do them, there are, like we've talked about, there are analogous existing human organisms that may have the same capacities and limitations, but in this case, it's intentional. So it certainly wouldn't stop it being a human organism. I think this is, it gets murky when we start talking about accounts of persons and things like that. But I think, like Helen, you've raised, if we just think about it as a human organism, but an intentionally damaged one is the way I kind of thought about it, irrespective of how they're created, whether it's adult stem cells or IVF.
Yeah,
yes,
Because
and
sometimes
as
you
soon
come
as
up against Helen.
sorry, I was just chip in quickly. And if organisms is what people think that humans are, then as soon as you've got a persisting entity, the way is clear to identify objective interests of that entity in his or her future. So if we're organisms, and if this is an organism, then it's got a stake in health, even if that's been deliberately damaged in advance. So sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I've sometimes come across the argument with regard to intentional damage that, well, you're giving this entity life, and so therefore that outweighs the intentional damage, which strikes me as a singularly perverse way of defining harm, as though you can't thereby meaningfully harm, or at least harm in a morally objectionable way, someone that you've given something to. And yet I've seen that in the literature again and again as a justification for the infliction of what Daniel's calling intentional damage here.
I do wonder, though, how important it is to settle the question of, what are these things, right? Because I think of, imagine like a robot that's designed to look like a human being. It's designed, it's like it's a sex robot or something like that. Like, we can debate, it doesn't matter so much that whether or not it's a human, because it's not, right? It's a robot, but it's human-like, and that there's like that symbolism, that social meaning, that the potential dignity threats that are contained therein. So even if it isn't a human, I still think the slippery slope concerns, that there's something inherently wrong with creating something that looks very much like a human, minus maybe a head or however, it pans out. But the symbolism and the social meaning of, just using it as an organ receptacle and all of that there is concerning to me.
I agree about that, but Helen's mention of conjoined twins did make me think of the example where you have a fully functioning twin, and attached to that twin is the body of a second twin, no head, and they're using the brainstem of the fully functional twin to sustain the body. And I know the status of that body to me seems a lot more uncertain, if you know what I mean. There's no brain, not even a brainstem really, because it's riding off the brainstem of the fully functioning twins. So I don't know. It's just something to throw into the mix. The other thing from the other point of view is I've read a bit here and there over the last few years about brain organoids, where scientists are putting a few brain cells together and trying to sort of examine how the brain works by having maybe 20 or 50 or brain cells, and they all sort of come together and start, having, I guess, some not a behavior, but they exhibit certain things. And there's been a lot of angst about, well, what if these little brain organoids are conscious? And it seems really weird that people are worried about these little brain organoids, whether they're going to be conscious when they're just a few brain cells. But it seems fine to discuss, reducing humans' brains and hopefully they're not conscious and all this kind of stuff. And we've basically got a human being there that we're trying to cripple. And yet there seems to be a concern about these little brain organoids. It just seems a little bit contradictory. Now, I guess they're totally different groups of people, but it just seems a bit disproportionate.
Okay, are there any
I'd say
other...
that's quite due to a quite a dominant and naive theory of mind. So there's like a philosophically dominant version of it, which is just like a standard kind of physicalism. You're going to be able to reduce the mind to physical matter, and then the assumption is it's going to be some kind of fancy brain neural electricity behavior, synaptic whatever, and then you can if that's true, no problem, you can just model that onto the behavior of large language models, and that's all consciousness is and all that kind of thing. And then that filters down into the public, into this very naive, the mind is in the brain, which is almost back to Descartes. It's so bad. It's just kind of, I think that's where the problematic comes from, and that might actually be a really good thing to add in. It's something that struck me when I was reading the paper, because if you can get people worried about consciousness and experiences of pain and qualitative experience of the bodyoid, or of any animal, whatever species it is, suddenly people back off and have quite a different reaction. There's even been stuff going about recently that maybe plants are feeling pain, so can't even be a vegetarian anymore. So, but anyway, joking aside, I think that comparison that you've made, Bruce, is very nice, and something that would really maybe make people think a little bit, especially if we just, short of kind of abandoning the common kind of naive theory of what and where a mind is, just at least even a worm can have like experiential um, qualities and experience, qualitative uh, consciousness in it in a way. So that's obviously what's going to happen here, and it's very hard to stipulate about, but that might be one reason for pushing. Although it's true that we can't really say much about what these bodyoids will be exactly, we could say enough to make ourselves a bit worried.
Yes, one of the problems is that debates about the role of the brain in the organism come up again, don't they? So yes, you're going to be worried about something that seems to manage to act as an organism, even if it doesn't have a brain. If you think that the brain's not doesn't necessarily have the kind of role it's often assumed to have, but whether the spinal column or whatever has more of a role than we think, or I don't know.
So we have another comment by Heidi Klessig. I found it interesting how Charlesworth et al. Justified the bodyoid idea. Brain dead people, in quotes, who are biologically alive but who have been declared legally dead are currently being used as test hosts for the implantation of genetically modified pig livers and kidneys. These brain injured people who are being used as xenograft hosts are certainly alive, since they are stable enough to be used as test subjects for implanted animal organs, until they are killed at the end of the experiment for further anatomical and microscopic analysis. The Stanford scientists use this ethically problematic practice to justify creating human clones for research. Quote, in all these cases, nothing was legally a living human being at the time it was used for research. Human bodyoids would also fall into that category, end quote.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of debate around the decedent research, these studies. Yeah, like Heidi was saying, the first sort of descendant studies, people were kept alive for a couple of hours to see how those organs functioned, and then this. I think the longest ones have lasted kind of several months, and these tends to be people who were wanted to donate organs but were ineligible for certain reasons. But I think in most cases, they got consent from the families for their bodies to be used in these studies. So I think, yeah, they are. Yeah, I suppose they are analogous in that way to some extent. I guess there are some how much weight you give to these will differ, but there are some key differences as well. Obviously, one is that those individuals haven't been intentionally created for that purpose alone. These are people who've had, in most cases, we read, long, valuable lives, with loved ones and families who have made a decision, an informed decision, in most cases, to have their bodies used. Now, whether we think that's right or not, we can debate. But these are people who have, willingly decided that their organs can be taken or their bodies can be used for these purposes. So, yeah, from a legal perspective, I think that's where they're most analogous. But I think there are some obvious differences as well. And me, like most other people, I think there's a lot to be uncomfortable with. I think with the descendant studies. But I do think there are significant differences between what's being proposed by Charlesworth and others.
Great. Well, are there any more comments or questions on this very rich topic? Okay, well, if not, I'd like to very much thank Daniel, Bruce, Christopher, and the second Daniel from all over on broaching this topic, and we'll give a round of applause or virtual round of applause as we have to do. And just to say thank you very much indeed for really, I mean, sort of your canaries in the mine, I think, on this topic, but obviously it links up with many other topics and also about the nature of medicine and the nature of human person, which is, of course, one of the most difficult and valuable topics anyone could discuss. Please do keep in touch with the work. We will be circulating the paper for anyone who hasn't read it, and do keep up with BIOS's work as well. If you can, please do donate to us. We very much rely on donations to keep going, and we will continue following all your work with great interest. So thank you very much again, and speak soon.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.